The battle raged on above the alien planet, with explosions and gunfire filling the air. Human soldier Ethan Walker stood firm, his rifle aimed at the enemy forces advancing on his position. His squadron was scattered, each soldier doing their best to hold their ground in the chaos of war. Ethan had seen combat before, but today it felt different. The stakes were higher. The planet was vital. A failure meant the loss of countless lives. The enemy forces had the upper hand, pushing the humans into a retreat. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but his training kept his mind focused. He wasn't about to lose this fight. He had a mission: get the civilians to safety. That was always the mission, as he moved through the battlefield. Dodging explosions and finding cover behind ruined structures, he heard a faint noise. At first, it was nothing more than a whisper against the backdrop of the war. But then it came again, louder this time. A cry, weak and filled with desperation. Without thinking, Ethan adjusted his grip on his rifle and began moving toward the sound. He pushed through debris, careful not to make any noise, but his heart was racing. What could it be? A civilian? A child? He couldn't risk leaving anyone behind. After what seemed like an eternity, he came upon the source of the sound. Beneath a pile of fallen rubble, a small figure lay curled up, barely visible. The child's cries had stopped, but Ethan could see her small, fragile, and covered in dust. She was motionless, barely breathing. Without hesitation, Ethan knelt beside her and began carefully pulling the debris off her tiny body. His hands moved quickly, but gently, as he worked to free the girl. She was thin, pale, and seemed too young to be in this place. Her wide eyes fluttered open as he lifted her from the wreckage, her gaze locking onto his for a brief moment before she winced in pain. "Hey, it's okay. You're safe now," Ethan whispered, though his voice cracked. With uncertainty, he wasn't sure if she could understand him. The girl's face was dirty and tear-streaked, but those eyes held a quiet, steady resolve. He cradled her in his arms, feeling her small form against his chest. She was light, almost weightless, and he couldn't help but notice how fragile she seemed. She seemed to trust him, though she didn't speak. Her small hands grasped the collar of his uniform, holding on like her life depended on it. Ethan stood up, his muscles sore from the constant movement of the fight. He glanced. Around, nothing but destruction, craters, and the bodies of fallen soldiers littered the ground. The enemy was advancing quickly, but he couldn't leave this girl behind. He wasn't sure why, but something about her pulled at him. Maybe it was the helplessness in her eyes. Maybe it was the way she clung to him, as if he were her last hope. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. There was no time to think about it. He had a job to do. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the battle. With the girl still in his arms, Ethan began to move, weaving between the wreckage of the battlefield, avoiding enemy fire when he could. His only goal was to get to the safe zone, a refuge where civilians were being sheltered. As he ran, the girl didn't struggle. She didn't cry out in fear, though the sounds of war were all around them. She simply stayed close, her grip tightening around his collar every time an explosion went off nearby. Ethan kept his focus ahead, but he could feel her presence, like a weight he couldn't explain, yet somehow it gave him strength. They moved fast, through ruined streets, past destroyed vehicles, and past alien creatures that seemed to be hunting. For survivors, Ethan's heart raced, but he didn't slow down. Not for a second. The girl needed him, and he couldn't afford to fail her. At one point, they came to a narrow alley. It was the only way forward, but Ethan could hear footsteps behind them. The enemy was getting closer. He pressed his back to the wall, trying to make himself and the girl invisible. His grip on the rifle tightened, ready to fight if needed. But the girl, she was calm, more calm than he was. She shifted slightly in his arms, her gaze scanning the area. It was as if she knew something he didn't, and just as he was about to move, she touched his arm gently. Her eyes met his once more, and for a brief moment, he felt an unspoken understanding between them. She trusted him completely. Without a word, she turned and pointed in the direction they needed to go. Ethan blinked in surprise. He couldn't explain it, but he nodded. "All right," he said quietly, following her lead. The journey was long, and the path to safety seemed endless. But with each step, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this girl, something he didn't understand. She wasn't just a victim of war, a helpless child caught in the crossfire. There was something about her that felt different. By the time they reached the safe zone, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the battlefield. Ethan's heart was still racing, but they had made it. The girl was safe, for now. But he couldn't help but feel that. This was just the beginning, with something important about her, something he needed to uncover. As they entered the shelter, the girl let go of his collar and stood beside him. Her eyes were calm, but Ethan could see the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It wasn't a smile of relief, but something else, something he didn't understand. "Thank you," Ethan whispered, his voice full of confusion and wonder. The girl didn't respond. She simply looked at him with those steady eyes, as if waiting for something. Ethan didn't know what it was, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would change everything. Ethan was exhausted. His muscles ached, and his mind raced with thoughts of the battle they had just barely escaped. But now, as he looked down at the small girl in his arms, all that mattered was getting her to safety. He couldn't understand why, but the connection he felt with her was undeniable. She wasn't just any child caught in the crossfire of war. There was something different about her. As they moved through the ruined streets, Ethan's attention remained on the girl. She didn't seem afraid. In fact, despite everything happening around them, she was eerily calm. Her small hand clutched his uniform, and she didn't flinch at the distant sounds of gunfire or explosions. It was as if she had seen this kind of destruction before, and nothing could shake her. They moved fast, making their way through debris and abandoned buildings, staying low and avoiding enemy patrols. The chaos of the battle outside the safe zone seemed miles away, but Ethan knew that danger was still lurking. The war was far from over, and it was only a matter of time before they encountered more enemies. Every now and then, Ethan would glance down at the girl. She was young, no more than 6 or 7, but her eyes were sharp. They glowed with a quiet wisdom that didn't match her age. We didn't know how to explain it, but there was something about her that felt older, wiser. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly, though he wasn't sure why he bothered. She couldn't answer. She hadn't spoken a word since he found her in the wreckage. The girl looked up at him, her wide eyes meeting his gaze, and for a moment it felt as though she understood exactly what he was saying. She gave a small nod and tightened her grip on his collar, as if reassuring him that she was fine. The moment passed, and she returned to her silent watch. After several hours, they reached a hidden bunker, a place Ethan had been told was safe for survivors. The door was guarded by 2 soldiers, both of whom eyed Ethan warily as he approached. It wasn't unusual for soldiers to be on edge in a war zone, but the girl's presence made the guards hesitate. She was a strange sight in a war, and the way she held on to Ethan only made things more complicated. Ethan explained quickly that the girl had been caught in the crossfire. The guards nodded but didn't say much. They weren't used to civilians, especially children, being brought into the bunker. Most people who had taken shelter there had seen too much of the horrors of war. They didn't know how to deal with anyone who hadn't been hardened by it. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, but there was a sense of relief. The walls of the bunker were thick, and the air was stale, but at least they were safe for now. Ethan sat the girl down on one of the benches along the wall, carefully watching her as she looked around the room with quiet curiosity. The others in the bunker kept their distance. A few glanced over at her, but no one approached. They all had their own fears to deal with. Ethan, however, couldn't stop staring at the girl. She wasn't like the others. There was a calmness in her that made her stand out. The girl's gaze flickered around the room and then settled on a small window. Near the ceiling, she stood up without a word and walked toward it. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he watched her. She didn't speak, but there was a purpose in her steps, like she knew where she was going. "Lyra," Ethan said softly, using the name she had given him earlier. She turned back to him, and for the first time, he saw something like a smile. tug at the corners of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was there. "What's going on in your mind?" Ethan asked, more to himself than her. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the window, and Ethan felt a strange sense of peace come over him. It was as if, despite everything, she had found a moment of clarity in the chaos. As night fell, the bunker became quieter. The sounds of distant fighting faded into the background, and the only noise was the steady hum of the bunker's generators. Ethan lay on the ground, keeping watch over the girl as she finally rested, curling up on the bench. Didn't seem to need much sleep. Even in her exhaustion, she remained alert, her eyes still searching, still taking in the world around her. Ethan's thoughts wandered as he stared up at the ceiling. He couldn't stop thinking about the way Lyra had reacted when they were escaping. The battlefield. She hadn't seemed scared or panicked. In fact, there had been moments when it almost seemed like she was guiding him. She had led him through the alleys and across dangerous territory with a calmness he couldn't understand. What was she? Where had she come from? Why had he felt so connected to her since the moment he found her? These questions gnawed at him, but he couldn't answer them. He had no answers. All he knew was that, somehow, he had to protect her. The silence in the bunker stretched on, and Ethan finally closed his eyes, his mind still racing. The girl was safe for now, but how long would that last? How long could they stay hidden before the enemy found them? Just as he was about to drift into a restless sleep, he heard a soft voice. It was so quiet that he almost missed it. "Thank you," Lyra whispered from the bench. Ethan's eyes snapped open, and he turned to look at her. She was still lying there, her eyes closed, but there was a look of peace on her face. Blinked in surprise. She had spoken. The first words she had spoken since he found her. "You're welcome," he replied, though his voice was full of uncertainty. "But I think you're the one who's keeping us safe." The girl didn't respond. She just smiled faintly. And for the first time, Ethan realized that maybe she knew more about the world than he did. Maybe she had a purpose, something bigger than either of them could understand. But for now, all he could do was protect her. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Ethan and Lyra stayed in the bunker, hidden away from the chaos of the war. Each day brought new challenges, but there was something different about Lyra. She seemed to be adapting to the strange new world she found herself in. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she was more than just a lost child. Despite the fact that she didn't speak much, Ethan started noticing things about her that didn't make sense. She moved with an unnatural grace, as if she was more aware of her surroundings than any child should be. And there was an intelligence in her eyes, a calm understanding that went beyond what a person her age should know. One morning, as Ethan was organizing his gear, he heard a sound coming from the corner of the room. It was faint, like a soft tapping. But when he turned, he saw that Lyra was standing by the wall, staring at something in the shadows. "What are you looking at?" he asked, his voice gentle. Lyra didn't turn to look at him. She simply pointed at the wall, where a small crack had appeared. It wasn't there the night before, and it seemed to grow wider with each passing second. Ethan walked over to her, his instincts telling him something was wrong. The crack began to pulse, faintly at first, then more clearly. It looked like something was trying to get through. There was no way to explain how or why this was happening. "Stay back, Ethan," said as he took a step toward the crack. He didn't know what was happening, but he had seen enough strange things in the war to know that sometimes the most unexpected dangers came in forms they couldn't even comprehend. But Lyra didn't listen. She stepped forward, her tiny hand reaching out toward the crack. As her fingers touched the wall, the pulsing stopped. The crack disappeared as if it had never been there. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what he had just witnessed. How had she done that? What had just happened? Lyra looked up at him with those familiar, knowing eyes. There was no fear. On her face, just calm understanding, as though this was something she did every day. "Lyra, what is it?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with both awe and confusion. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she walked away, as if nothing had happened, and sat back down on the bench. Ethan couldn't stop staring at her. What was she? Later that evening, as the bunker settled into silence, Ethan found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened since he found Lyra. There was something about her that didn't make sense, something deep within her that seemed far beyond her years. He had no answers, but he knew one thing for sure: the girl wasn't just a child. There was something extraordinary about her. The next day, a visitor arrived at the bunker, a scientist named Dr. Alina. She had been traveling with a group of refugees, and though she seemed out of place among the hardened soldiers, there was something about her that made Ethan trust her. She was kind, calm. She seemed to understand more than she let on. Dr. Alina approached Ethan and Lyra, her gaze landing on the girl with a mixture of curiosity and surprise. It wasn't long before Dr. Alina took an interest in Lyra, offering to examine her for any signs of injury or trauma. Ethan was hesitant at first, unsure of how to explain the situation. He didn't know what was happening with Lyra, and he wasn't sure he wanted anyone else getting too close. But Dr. Alina was persistent, and eventually, Ethan agreed. He stayed in the room, watching closely as Dr. Alina examined Lyra with care. The girl didn't resist, sitting quietly on the bench while the scientist ran various tests. After a few minutes, Dr. Alina stepped back, her eyes wide with disbelief. "She's different," Dr. Alina said quietly. Her voice was filled with awe, but there was also something else, something Ethan couldn't quite place. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, his heart racing with a mix of concern and curiosity. Dr. Alina hesitated for a moment, glancing at Lyra. Her DNA, she began slowly. "It's unlike anything I've ever seen before. There are traces of human and alien genetics, mixed together, almost as if she were the product of a genetic experiment. But the patterns don't match anything we know." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. This was more than he could process. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what Dr. Alina was saying. "Are you saying she's some kind of hybrid?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Alina nodded, her expression serious. "Yes, but this isn't just any hybrid. This is something far more advanced. Whoever created her didn't just mix human and alien DNA, they combined it in a way that I've never seen before. And the results are astonishing." Ethan's mind was spinning. His gaze turned to Lyra, who was still sitting quietly on the bench, as if none of this concerned her. "Why is she with me?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Why was she on that planet? Why did I find her?" Dr. Alina looked at him with sympathy. "I don't know. But there's one thing I do know for sure. She's important. Very important." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What was he supposed to do with this information? The girl he had saved wasn't just a lost child, she was a key part of something much bigger. Something that could change everything. As he watched Lyra, a new sense of responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't just her protector. Anymore, he was part of a story he didn't fully understand. The girl was more than he could ever have imagined. Days passed, and the bunker became their temporary home. Ethan had grown used to the quiet, though he often found himself staring at Lyra, lost in thought. She had become a mystery he couldn't ignore. There were so many questions swirling in his mind, and no one seemed to have answers. It wasn't just her strange abilities that set her apart. There was a connection between them that felt deeper than anything he had ever experienced. She was no longer just a child he had rescued from the wreckage of a battle. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the tests Dr. Alina had run on her. The results had been impossible to believe. Lyra's DNA was a blend of human and alien, mixed together in a way that didn't make sense. But beyond that, there was something more. A unique signature in her genetic makeup. Dr. Alina couldn't explain it, and neither could Ethan. But one thing was clear. Lyra wasn't just a child. She was a key to something far bigger than any of them could understand. One evening, after the sun had set and the bunker was bathed in the soft glow of dim lights, a new group of survivors arrived. They were exhausted, their faces covered in dirt and fear, but they had made it through the chaos of the battle. As they entered the bunker, Ethan stood up to greet them. scanning the group for any familiar faces. The last thing he expected was to see Dr. Alina's expression shift from calm to shock. Her eyes widened as she locked gazes with one of the newcomers. It was a man, tall and lean, with sharp features that looked familiar but were somehow foreign. His eyes, though, were what caught Ethan's attention. They were intense. Filled with an unmistakable sense of recognition, Dr. Alina walked quickly toward him, her face tense. Ethan watched as they exchanged a few quiet words, and then she turned back to him. "He's the one," she said, her voice filled with awe. "He's the one who started it all." Ethan was confused, but his curiosity outweighed his confusion. He approached the man, who was now looking at Lyra with the same intense gaze. "I'm Ethan," he said, offering his hand. The man looked at it for a moment before shaking it firmly. "Dr. Isaac Knight," the man said, his voice calm but serious. "I know who you are, Ethan. I've been following your progress since the beginning." Ethan's mind raced. "Following my progress? What do you mean?" Isaac nodded toward Lyra, who was still sitting on the bench. She had been watching the conversation unfold but didn't speak. Her eyes flickered between Dr. Alina and Isaac, but she didn't seem startled or scared. She was still, her expression unreadable. "She's the key," Isaac said softly, his voice barely audible. "Lyra is the result of a project I started years ago. A project that was supposed to change everything." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected that Lyra wasn't just any child, but hearing this from someone who was clearly involved in her creation was another shock entirely. "What kind of project?" Ethan asked, his voice firm. Isaac looked at him for a long moment before answering. "It was supposed to be a way to bridge the gap between humans and the alien species we were at war with. A hybrid, someone who could bring peace and understanding between us. But things didn't go as planned. We lost control of the experiment. Lyra was the result of that failure." Ethan looked at Lyra, who still hadn't spoken, but there was a strange feeling in his chest. It was as if the pieces of a puzzle were starting to fit together. But he didn't fully understand the picture yet. "So you're saying she was created on purpose?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "To be some kind of peacekeeper?" Isaac nodded. "That was the idea, but it didn't work. The experiment went too far, and we lost track of the results. I thought she was destroyed, but it seems she survived." Ethan's mind was spinning. He had so many questions, but one stood out above the rest. Why is she here? Why did I find her on that battlefield? Isaac looked over at Lyra. "Because she's more than just an experiment. She's a person who has the potential to change everything. But she can't do it alone. She needs guidance. She needs protection. And Ethan, you're the one who can help her." Ethan shook his head. "I'm not a scientist. I'm just a soldier." "You're more than that," Isaac said, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "You're the one she trusts. You're the one she's connected to. And whether you like it or not, you're part of this now." Ethan stared at Isaac, trying to process everything he had just heard. Lyra, the little girl he had saved from the wreckage, wasn't just any child. She was the result of an experiment meant to change the course of the war. And now she was in his care. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than anyone was telling him. There was something about Lyra that made her different from the other survivors. Something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. As the night wore on, Ethan found himself thinking about the future. He couldn't just protect her from the war. He had to understand her, help her unlock whatever potential she had. But that would mean facing the truth about her origins and about himself. "Are you sure you want to be involved in this?" Dr. Alina asked, her voice quiet but filled with concern. Ethan didn't hesitate. "I don't have a choice, do I, Doctor?" Alina looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "No, you don't." Ethan turned to look at Lyra once more. She was still sitting on the bench, her eyes closed now, as if she was waiting for something. Ethan couldn't explain why, but he felt like she was waiting for him to figure it out, waiting for him to understand what came next. The journey was just beginning. No matter where it led, he knew that Lyra was no longer just a child. She was the future. The days following Isaac's arrival at the bunker were filled with uncertainty. Ethan found himself trying to understand the weight of what Isaac had told him. Lyra was not just a child she had rescued, she was something more she was part of. An experiment meant to bring peace to the galaxy, a mix of human and alien genetics. Ethan had heard of such projects before, but never one with this level of secrecy. Now, his world was turning upside down, and he didn't know how to process it all. The more he thought about it, the more questions he had. Isaac had told him that Lyra was the key. But the truth was, Ethan still didn't understand what that meant. The little girl who had clung to him for safety, who had stayed calm in the midst of a deadly war, was somehow tied to the future of humanity. Ethan spent hours talking with Isaac and Dr. Alina, trying to piece together what had happened. They told him about the experiment that had been started years ago. It was meant to create a being who could understand both humans and aliens, someone who could help bridge the gap between two warring species. But it hadn't gone as planned. The project was abandoned, and everyone thought it had failed. But now it seemed Lyra was the result. Of that failure, she had survived. As the days went by, Ethan watched Lyra closely. He was still unsure of the exact nature of her abilities, but he knew one thing. She wasn't like any child he had ever known. Sometimes she would stand quietly by the window, staring out at the dark sky. Other times, she would sit with her, hands folded in her lap, her eyes focused on something no one else could see. One night, as Ethan sat beside her, he noticed something strange. Her eyes, those deep, wise eyes, seemed to glow faintly in the dark room. He reached out to touch her arm, and when she turned to face him, he felt a surge of energy. It was unlike anything he had felt before, but it was strangely comforting. "Lyra," Ethan said softly, "what is it? What's inside you?" For a moment the girl said nothing. Then slowly, she spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "I can hear them," said, her voice trembling slightly. "The voices of the stars, they tell me things. Things that have happened, things that are going to happen." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "The stars?" Lyra nodded. "They speak to me. Sometimes I don't understand everything they say, but I know they're trying to show me the way." Ethan didn't know what to make of her words, but he couldn't ignore the serious tone in her voice. It was as if she was more connected to the universe than anyone he had ever met. Her abilities were far beyond anything he had experienced before. "Do you know what they're telling you now?" he asked, trying to understand. Lyra's eyes softened. "They're telling me that I have a purpose. I'm here for a reason. I'm not just a mistake." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. The girl had always known more than she let on. But now, it seemed like she was starting to understand her own role in all of this. He had no idea what kind of power she had. But he knew one thing for sure. She wasn't just a victim of war. She was the key to something bigger, something that could change the entire galaxy. The next day, as the bunker continued to buzz with activity, Ethan found himself alone with Isaac. The scientist was deep in thought, his gaze fixed on the map of the galaxy spread out before him. "Isaac," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "What does this all mean? What is she supposed to do? What am I supposed to do?" Isaac looked up, his eyes tired but determined. "Lyra's abilities go far beyond what we can understand right now. She has the potential to unite the galaxy, to bring peace between humans and the alien species. But that peace isn't going to come easily. There are still factions out there who want nothing more than to see humanity wiped out." Ethan frowned. "So what do we do now?" Isaac sighed and stood up, walking over to the wall where a set of coordinates were marked. "We need to find the others. The ones who helped create Lyra. They have the answers, and they might hold the key to unlocking her true potential." Ethan's stomach tightened. "But where do we even start looking?" Isaac paused, his expression grave. "I've been tracking them for years. They're hidden, but I've narrowed down their location. We'll have to move quickly before they disappear again." Ethan nodded. He didn't know what to expect from this journey, but he knew one thing. It was no longer just about surviving the war. It was about protecting Lyra and discovering what she was truly capable of. Later that night, as the bunker settled into silence, Ethan found himself standing by the window, staring out at the stars. Lyra had spoken about them, about the voices. That guided her, but he couldn't understand how a child could know so much. He turned to look at her, sitting quietly in the corner of the room. For the first time, he saw a different kind of strength in her. It wasn't just the calmness she had shown in the midst of chaos. It was something deeper, something that made her more than just a survivor of war. She was a symbol of hope, and he was beginning to realize that she was the galaxy's last hope for peace. Ethan walked over to her and knelt down, meeting her gaze. "Lyra, I don't know what's coming, but I'm going to protect you. We'll get through this together." Lyra looked at him with those wise eyes, and for the first time, a real smile spread across her face. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She wasn't alone anymore. And neither was he. The journey ahead would be dangerous, but together, they might just have a chance at saving the galaxy. Ethan stood at the entrance of the bunker, looking out at the darkened horizon. The night had fallen, and the only sound was the quiet hum of the shelter's generators. His mind was filled with thoughts of the journey ahead, a journey that would take him, Lyra, and the small group of survivors to the heart of the war. They had to find the people behind Lyra's creation, the ones who had the answers they desperately needed. But even more pressing was the truth Lyra had revealed to him. The voices of the stars, her connection to something greater than herself. Ethan didn't fully understand it, but he could feel the weight of her purpose. She wasn't just a child caught in the crossfire of a war. She was the key to everything. The peace they all longed for, the future of humanity, all depended on her. Behind him, Lyra stood quietly, her gaze focused on the stars above. She had been different ever since she had spoken of the voices. She wasn't the same frightened girl Ethan had found on the battlefield. She had become something else, something powerful, something beyond understanding. Ethan felt the familiar weight of his rifle against his back, but it was no longer just a weapon. It was a symbol of his role as her protector. They were in this together, didn't know what they would face on this journey. But he knew one thing for sure. He would do whatever it took to keep her safe. Dr. Alina approached, her face tired, but determined. She had been working tirelessly to track down the people who had created Lyra. The maps and coordinates they had gathered showed they were close. Too close to turn back now. The next move would be the most dangerous yet. "We found them," Dr. Alina said softly, her voice tense. "They're hiding in an abandoned facility on the outskirts of the galaxy. It's isolated, heavily guarded. But it's our best chance to get the answers we need." Ethan nodded. "That's where we're going. We leave at first light." As the survivors prepared for the journey, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The enemy was still out there, and every moment they spent hiding was a moment they couldn't afford. They had to move quickly before they were discovered. And Lyra's future, her purpose, depended on what they would find at that facility. The next morning, they set out. The group traveled in silence, the weight of the mission heavy on all their shoulders. The landscape outside the bunker was harsh and unforgiving, but they moved forward without hesitation. The planet was nothing like Earth, its surface scarred by years of war. The air was thick, and the skies were always overcast, giving everything a gray, lifeless appearance. As they neared the facility, the tension in the air grew. Ethan could feel it in the pit of his stomach. They were close, but they were also being watched. Enemy knew they were coming. Suddenly, an explosion rocked the ground beneath them. Blast sent shockwaves through the air, and Ethan barely managed to keep his footing. The facility was no longer a secret. The enemy had found them. "Move now," Ethan shouted, his voice filled with urgency. He grabbed Lyra's arm, pulling her into motion as the others followed. They ran toward the entrance of the facility, dodging enemy fire as they went. The sounds of battle filled the air as they fought their way through, the heavy thud of footsteps echoing in the narrow hallways. The walls of the facility were cold and metal, stark contrast to the chaos outside. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but his focus was sharp. He knew what they were up against. This was at the final stand. If they didn't succeed here, everything they had fought for would be lost. As they moved deeper into the facility, they encountered more resistance. The enemy was well prepared, but they weren't expecting Lyra. She was their secret weapon. The one thing they had underestimated. The deeper they went, the stronger Lyra's presence seemed to become. Her powers, whatever they were growing. Stronger with every step they took. Lyra's eyes glowed faintly as they rounded a corner. And for the first time, Ethan saw the power she held inside her. It was as if the very energy of the universe was flowing through her. The walls seemed to bend and shift around her, and the air crackled with the force she was channeling. "Lyra, be careful," Ethan shouted, but it was too late. She stepped forward, and with a single gesture, the enemy soldiers in front of them were knocked back, thrown against the walls by an unseen force. Ethan's eyes widened. He had never seen anything like it before. Lyra wasn't just a child. She was something else entirely. She wasn't just a survivor of war. She was the key to their victory. They pushed forward, breaking through the final line of defense. The last door to the inner chamber stood before them, but it was locked. In there was no time to waste. "Lyra, can you do it?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with urgency. The girl nodded, her eyes focused on the door. Slowly, her small hands extended, and the door began to creak open. The air around them shimmered as her power grew stronger. They entered the chamber, and at last, they found what they had been searching for. The people behind the experiment were waiting for them, but they were not the welcoming committee Ethan had hoped for. They were enemies, dressed in lab coats and armed with weapons. Isaac stepped forward, his eyes cold. "You're too late," he said, his voice flat. This was never about peace. It was about control. Lyra was never meant to be your ally. She was always meant to be a weapon. Ethan felt a rush of anger. "No," he said firmly, his voice steady. "She's more than that. She's our future. We're going to make sure it's a future where peace is possible." The fight was not over. It had only just begun. But as Ethan looked at Lyra, he knew that they had a chance. This was the key, and together they would change the galaxy.